But what are the ones you really need to understand to make a positive contribution and to make positive forward progress? And that to me is the real struggle at the moment, because if you get wrapped up in all the details, you can really go off the rails fairly quickly. So the last 24 years have really been an evolution of that. And after Paris, so I had been at the UN, left the UN, gone to Harvard, spent a number of years there. I was a little disappointed in the corporate engagement on this topic, decided to go off and do it more on my own. And the first book I wrote, which is Sustainability is the New Advantage, was really an outgrowth of my workshops, which said, how do you get started? And if you look at the book, it's really a reflection of the way I train. And it starts with the idea of who's accountable, who's responsible, what are the new business models looking like? How do you begin to think of something that's different than the way we've normally done it? How do you frame a vision? How do you do experiments? How do you embed these ideas in your culture, et cetera, et cetera? And at the end, I give you lots of resources which are cross-referenced to all the SDGs. The second book, which Scott referenced, is about how do you accelerate action? And that, again, you got to get started. But once you get started, how do you move faster? And of course, moving faster is relevant when you say, well, because we're behind the curve. We've expended our carbon budget. We're moving too slow. We're going to blow through 1.5 degrees. And by the way, all these other issues of gender and equity and poverty will get worse as we have more climate risk in the planet. And then I'm working on a third book, which is on leading sustainable organizations. And again, once you accelerate, you've got to sustain this over time. You've got to switch through your leadership teams without taking a step backwards. You've got to keep moving forward. You really have to make that core to the business. And like anything else, I map out in both the existing books and that books. It's all a journey. It's a pathway. And you have to understand where you are, but you can also use those tools on a sales side to understand where are your customers, where are your users. Because if you don't understand where they are, and you're a bank, let's say, well, then you don't understand how to help them with capital to make positive forward progress. If someone else is much further along, again, you've got to meet them because they're past that idea. They're now past experimentations and they're trying to scale, and that's a totally different set of challenges. So my focus is always organizational behavior, learning and knowledge management. And that's really what I focus on. And along the way, because of my various experiences, I've had the chance to live and work in 50-something countries. I'm talking to you from Bangkok, which I've called my home for most of the past 10 years. But in each of those experiences, you sort of layer on the challenge. I was interviewing yesterday folks in Bhutan who have this very interesting innovation lab and a very interesting partnership with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And they're doing these things. And I don't like to write about people like Unilever or Elon Musk or things like this. I think those already been talked about. And to a large degree, they're really not repeatable. I mean, Elon Musk is not a repeatable example. He and his brother own all the controlling stock in the company anyway, so you can't fire the guy. So despite the fact that he does crazy things, he still gets to keep his job. But what you really have to figure out is most companies are legacy, right? They exist already. They're not brand new. And therefore, you have to have a starting point wherever you are now, and you've got to figure out a way to get to the future while maintaining jobs, while maintaining revenues, et cetera. And that is the real challenge. And as I try to write in the books, the only way we're going to reach Paris goals by 2030 is if existing leaders make the change. This is not a task for 2030 for college students. Can't do anything about it. It's not a task for little kids. Can't do anything about it. You've got to be in a position of authority already, and you can make change. And that does not preclude everybody else from being advocates and doing interesting things. But nevertheless, if you really want to make positive forward progress globally, you've got to be in a certain number of companies. And what I talk about in the second book is it gets remarkably simple when you start narrowing it down to how many, who owns all the oil reserves on planet Earth. A very small number of national oil companies who do that. If you get down to how many companies really control all the food we eat, a fairly small number of companies who have a majority influence on that. So the more you get into this, you say, all right, if I really want to make a task, I don't have to get 8 billion people to change. which would be the current population of the world. I got to get some companies to get over a tipping point. And to do that, again, requires behavioral change. And that's the name of the game. So anyway, that's me in a nutshell. And I continue to do teaching. And because I think at the end of the day, everything's about education. I've got to get thousands and thousands, if not millions and millions of people to change their behavior and turn their mental models around a little bit. And that is not an easy task. Wow. Anyway, did I accomplish the task of introducing myself?
You did indeed. Thanks a million, Peter. I'm very impressed, and I've got about 1 million questions. But we started off talking about that you lived in different countries already, and you just mentioned it now in your introduction. So I'd like to start off, let's say, our interview about these other countries, because you mentioned you live in Bangkok at the moment. Do you notice there is a different stance towards sustainability challenges in the different countries you've traveled and lived? And so do people look at challenges in a different way when they live somewhere else?
Well, the answer in general is yes. There's been a lot of work over the decades on the idea of culture. And I think it's not surprising that in some areas of the world where you have a more of a community-based culture, the Nordic countries, parts of Europe, parts of Asia, that it's easier to align around something like wearing a mask for COVID. Yeah. Whereas countries with individual cultures all want their own solutions. And there's benefits to both. But for better or worse, the world is driven by certain large economies. Mm-hmm. And that is, again, being practical about this, that's where you have to solve. Everybody has to come along. But a country like Thailand is really in the middle of the supply chain on hundreds and hundreds of different products. So for automobiles, they're critical. If Thailand doesn't produce all of its parts, you don't get a car. Yeah. Nevertheless, they don't build any cars. So they are part of that process. And so you have to understand where they are. You have to understand their unique governance processes. They've just had their, whatever it is, 10th or 12th military coup a few years ago. It's kind of like governments in Italy. It happens on a regular recurring business. We throw everything up in the world and change. And they still have a very strong monarchy, and they're a Buddhist country. And all of those things have an influence. And to some degree, I think the Buddhist culture is very positive towards sustainability and climate change.
Yeah, definitely.
Although, I often point out to people, none of the major religions in the world say despoil the planet and, dump plastics into the ocean. This is not part of any religious philosophy anywhere. So in some ways, I think we have to use these belief systems, right, as allies. And in many ways, what you confront these days is you have empirical truths. I can show you exactly why climate change is happening. You then, unfortunately, have this big middle of social truths, which, because it's out on the internet and it's mentioned 10 gazillion times, everyone believes it, whether it has any truth or not. But then you also have personal beliefs and personal truths. And, I can't control whether someone believes the Earth is 7,000 years old or something like that. And I don't see it as my role to fight them on that. I think that I have to meet people where they are. And regardless of that personal belief system, I don't see that as the problem. Social truths are a problem. Misinformation is a problem. But again, I think corporations have a big part to play there. And again, I do address that misinformation because I think that's key to accelerating action. And you can have a big impact within a company on the people who work there on that regard.
Yeah. Yeah. So what you're saying is you need to, well, let's say, make use of these, well, personal truths for sure, maybe also social truth in a way that you can influence them. But let's use what's already there, and then if you work with that, you can you can come further. Let's put it that way. You can reach more than if you sort of
absolutely
try to rebel against what people believe. Yeah, I can see that, Peter. Thank you. There was another thing that I thought was really interesting. You mentioned working knowledge. At least that's what I've written down. Maybe I'm not rephrasing it exactly as you mentioned it. But so you need to figure out, you can't know everything that there is to know in this space. And I don't know about other people that are part of this meetup now, this meeting, but I do recognize that a lot. There is so much to know, you can't possibly even get started. So you mentioned, which really struck me, is, well, you need to know what the working knowledge is. What do you really need to know? And then, of course, well, I was wondering, and maybe other people were wondering too, so how do you know what this working knowledge is? How do you figure out how that works?
Well, generally speaking, people hire me to answer that question. But beyond that, what I've tried to write in the books is I think you can break knowledge. Now, again, I had the advantage of when I was at Harvard Business Publishing as managing director there and sitting on their executive committee, really had a lot of wonderful people. And very often when we were publishing, we had a magazine called the Harvard Business Review. And we didn't really want to publish anything that someone else had already done. Now, in the world of publishing, that's a little bit difficult because everything is an iteration, right, of some idea. But at the end of the day, you really have to sit down. And one way of thinking about this, which is the way I describe in the book, is there is certain knowledge of enduring value, right? So that's category one. And there are some things that if I think about sustainability and climate change, I need to ask, well, what has changed, right? So if I go back and think about strategy, and I think of Bill Bain and Fred Gluck at McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group and Michael Porter and all these people who created what we understand today as strategy and competitive differentiation. Well, does sustainability change that or not? So there's a category there that says, no, there's certain knowledge of enduring value that even though it's 20 or 30 years old, it's still relevant. And it doesn't need to change. So, and I would put some of Michael Porter's work on competitive advantage into that category. Location advantage is still location advantage. That doesn't really change with the concept of sustainability. Now, some things do. And there's another category. So beyond knowledge of enduring value, I'd say there's a category of contextual knowledge. And contextual knowledge is that, if or but, it depends. Depends on the industry, depends on the context. So, and a lot of businesses sit in this space where they say, well, what do I need to know? And so we start saying, well, what's your legal status? What country are you headquartered in? Where are your customers? What exchange are you traded on? And you go through a series of questions, all of which say, well, here are some compliance things you have to do because it's defined by what you just described, right? So if I'm in Europe these days, the new corporate sustainability reporting directive, well, everybody's got to worry about that. And if I'm a company down here in a textile company in Thailand, and I'm going to sell into the United States, well, then I really should worry about the new SEC regulations on disclosures, because Nike, who I'm selling to, is going to need that because they have to report on scope 3 emissions, which is me. So whether I want to do it or not, if I want to sell to Nike, I've got to do that. So there is a way to do this and to get yourself in the zone, as it says. And then we've gotten a lot of harmonization on reporting with, there are various global goals and protocols with the SDGs and the greenhouse gas protocol, et cetera, and reporting frameworks, whether it's TCFD or the newer one on biodiversity task force and ISO and integrated reporting. And again, you can work through that to regulatory guidelines, et cetera. So there's a process of working through that says for your specific company, for your specific value proposition, here's a pathway to get started. Right? Yeah. Now, with that, I always tell people that that's only step one, right? Because if you just do everything I said, which everybody in your industry is also doing, that's called compliance. That's not called competitive differentiation, right? So if everybody does exactly the same thing, you're not special. So you still have to go to that next level to say, how am I solving this problem uniquely different in a way where I'm creating new value? And that's the part everybody struggles with because they spend so much time on all this reporting stuff and they get bogged down on, oh my God, I got to get my ESG report done by a certain date, that they miss the key point, which is, what are you doing different that's really going to change the world? and then how are you going to do that and within a business model that really makes sense? Or how are you evolving yourself over the next 5 years from where you are now to what that needs to be? So again, it is easy to describe, as I have, and it is quite difficult to do, and to get an entire organization, you get 10,000 people to change and to move in a certain direction. That's the real craft and the leadership challenge of how to get that done and do it in a meaningful way.
Yeah, exactly. Doing a bit more besides what you need to do anyway, and how to tap into that. I'm continuing on this. Vinit is, I'm not sure if I pronounce your name in the right way, but he's asked a question in the chat about, well, maybe you'd like to pose your question yourself before I start reading out what you've already typed up. So that's a question for you, Peter.
So thank you, Maurice. Your pronunciation was correct, by the way. So actually, I was asking for someone who's starting out in the sustainability sector after being in, say, the social sector for a long period of time. What would you recommend learning first? Because when I started in the sector, the biggest confusion for me, especially as I'm from India, is there's way too many different reporting frameworks. And like you would assume that everything has a lot of commonalities, but then when you start reading up about it, you're like, why is this different? And why is this, so different?
Yeah.
So
So
what would you
basically,
recommend?
where to get started? Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
so that you have a competitive advantage at the start, that I know this well.
Well, I worked a lot in consulting, and even when I was at the United Nations, I felt I was a consultant because I was dropping into a different country and I'm trying to figure something out. And I always found it useful to try to sit down for a weekend and review all the documentation in that organization that I could get there. What's their strategy? What's their progress? Everything. And if I was totally confused by the end of the weekend, I was pretty comfortable that everybody else in the organization was totally confused, and that probably no one had done the deep dive I had done. And therefore, that's my starting point. So in consulting, it's always important to realize you have to have a vision for where you want to go, but you also have to have the starting point. And the starting point is simply defined from where you are. The sustainability space is what I describe as a low maturity knowledge space, which is why there's so much nonsense out there, right? Because a lot of people are, throwing solutions at the wall, and they're partially correct. But again, if you take the time to sit down and look at all these things, you can look through this and say, you know what? There's that Bob Eccles. His name keeps popping up in here. He was over at Harvard, and then he moved over to Oxford, and he's in the integrated reporting, and now he's over here at SASB, and what's going on here? And you realize that GRI is not aligned. But until you look back and say, well, GRI was never started with sustainability in mind. It was started because of the Exxon Valdez disaster in 1997. And the fact that Kyoto happened the same year is a total coincidence. It's got nothing to do with it. So over 20 years, people are coming together, but they're all coming together around a definition of sustainability, which we have created in 2015. It's the first ever comprehensive definition. And even there, we know it's not right. It's the product of 198 different countries attempting to negotiate a solution, which is why you come up with 17 goals, and some of them are not really goals. They're 2 goals in one, and it doesn't include governance, and it doesn't include profitability. And it's because they probably got to a Friday and said, okay, 17, can we agree on 17? All right, let's all go home. And we've made progress. So to me, I think in the marketplace at the moment, there's a lot of interesting starting places, which really comes down to what are you passionate about? Do you want to be in a technical specialty? Do you want to be on the organizational side? Where do you want to be? There are more NGOs than you can shake a stick at. India, in particular, has had a huge boom, right? A huge boom in foundations. So you have people like Anand Mahindra. All of a sudden, he's got foundations and things going on. Where 20 years ago, you never really saw that in India. You have India is the most populous country on planet Earth, certainly as of next year. I think it's a debate whether they've already passed that threshold. So the world cannot reach its goals without India. So I start right there. And you look around, and there are lots of jobs within corporations, within NGOs, within the big intergovernmentals. And I think there's, I would encourage you to find something though that you personally, from your own research, really gets you out of bed in the morning, and that you find exciting, because I think that's the name of the game in terms of job satisfaction. So I don't know if I've answered it, but in my first book, I addressed the issue of how do you become a sustainability champion. And I believe in that first book, there are about 200 different references at the end, all cross-referenced. So if you believe that where your passion is gender equity, or your passion is hunger, or your passion is, microfinance, or whatever it is, there's a space for you. But all knowledge in corporate environments start out in generalist positions and migrate towards specialty positions. And we are still just in that transition, right? So there are really only a few kinds of roles that have emerged for which there's a clear career path to what a chief sustainability officer. There's every flavor under the sun for that role. And most people who've got the job because they raised their hand and said, all right, I'll do that. And their background is in agriculture, their background is in engineering, their background is in organizational behavior, their background is in marketing. It really has no impact whatsoever. So again, I think you probably have about 1,000 choices if you want to do something. And you have to be confident. What disruptive innovation tells us, you don't have to know everything. You just have to know more than the other person. All right. It's the old adage of how fast you have to run if you're being chased by a bear. You don't have to run faster than the bear. You just have to run faster than the guy who's next to you, and let the bear catch them. So part of this is not knowing everything, but coming back to that idea of what do I think is stable, and what are those aspects are evolutionary. And I'll point you to 2 articles. One in 2010 in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which was written about design thinking, about this is the key to social innovation. And last month they wrote one that says, basically design thinking has failed us. So nice 13-year review. It's the same topic, but you have to ask the question, why is it failing? And it's because old mental models try to force us to think a certain way, when the reality is, to really make progress, I've got to not throw it out. Right? Some of it is content of enduring value, but how do I evolve it based on these new parameters? And those parameters are really where your thinking adds value. So hopefully I at least partially answered your question.
Well, I guess so.
Thank you.
Yes, exactly. I could see you nodding already. So that's excellent. So thanks a lot. There is a question that popped into my mind that has everything to do with raising your hand and being confident and gender equity. But I'll park that for a minute, because Mike kindly pointed me to a question Anna posed already before. And also, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Are you okay with asking your question yourself, or would you like me to do it? Because Anna posed a question in the chat for you.
I can ask the question. Yeah, good morning. No, I can ask the question myself. Yeah, I was typing and then I thought, this is a long question. I can just talk about it. Basically, I have started recently my own company. The aim is to provide sustainability reporting and a circular economy assessment. Now, being obviously one person, I'm concentrating on, in terms of clients, in targeting sole traders and small company, simply because I wouldn't have obviously the bandwidth to tackle these topics with the big company. I'm doing business networking, obviously, for brand awareness. This is $1 million question. How do I get my first couple of clients to build obviously my corporate credibility? Because obviously talking to people, at some point they're bound to ask, well, who have you done this for, and what are your client, and who have you worked with? At the moment I haven't worked with anybody, so how do I break that sort of glass ceiling? Thank you.
Well, I think there's several ways to address that. First is this is a problem that every new business has faced, through eternity. And I've started a number of businesses. And part of what you always have to do is, and again, design thinking always tells you have to have empathy towards your user groups. You have to really understand, is what I'm offering a nice to have or a need to have? All right. If it's a nice to have, your business is going to fail. All right. It has to be a need to have, and it has to address an absolute immediate need for them to take the risk of going with a new player. You also have to understand what's the competition in the space. All right. So you could do reporting a number of years ago, and there was nobody there. So pretty much anybody could step up to the plate. Now, when you have MSCI and Bloomberg and these other huge companies getting involved, generally people don't like to take risk. So they say, Bloomberg, that seems pretty risk-free. I'll call them in. And they have really nice PowerPoint presentations, and they, all kinds of other stuff. And they give me free coffee mugs that have their logos on it. And I like that. So you have to get by that. And generally speaking, the issue always is relationships. Right? So you got to figure out where you have good relationships. And then it's not unusual that you have to do some free stuff. All right. You give people the offer they can't refuse. Let me do an experiment with you. I want to prove out this methodology. You have no obligation. And I often do that in consulting, because the key in consulting is not to leave the room without getting a yes. All right. And so you always have to be thinking of, what's the risk to yes? All right. So let me eliminate all the risk. So, I don't need to have a contract. I'm going to do the following for you. And you let me come in and collect the data and present this to you. And if you're happy, then we move on with the contract. If we don't, you say bye to me. But that's also good feedback to you. And again, most people, discredit salespeople, but there's a reason salespeople get paid a lot of money sometimes, because getting in and getting the deal and describing it correctly is not an easy thing. And that's where you have to decide, are you that person, or do you have to work through someone else who is that person? So again, sometimes there are people. I work for a little company in San Francisco that does board education. And the company is essentially started off with one person, like yourself. But everybody else she aggregated around, who have no financial obligation, who don't get paid unless there's work, but that helped to build the brand and things like that. And you can also do other things by going to conferences and talking, and again, to get exposure for who you are and some of your ideas. But at the end of the day, you still have to be hitting a hot button. All right. Where's the pain point in your industry that you can add value to, that people are going to say, I don't mind paying you to do that? Or even, are you the person who gives a second opinion or a third opinion? Right. There's a lot of value in that too. So again, but that's all coming down to, I'm trying to describe your pitch. Someone might say, listen, I already use MSCI. And your pitch is, well, that's great. They do nice work. But there's also been 9 lawsuits filed against them for various work. So what I am is, I'm your third party opinion, right? That validates that. So think of it as the cost of insurance. Validation. So all that comes down to, again, what is your competitive advantage? And how does that drive value in this industry? And I'll guarantee you that a lot of issues in reporting are creating space, because people have been lying, people have been stretching the truth on carbon credits, people have been misrepresenting all sorts of data. Even what's it called? North Pole. Am I getting the name right? Very, very big consulting company, went public, very, very big in the carbon credit industry. And unfortunately, they got engaged in a lot of projects where it's turned out to be absolutely wrong in terms of what's happening. And almost all of the data now out there is questionable. So it becomes really important to find your little niche in that space. And then you got to do it better than everybody else. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just has to be better than the other person to offer a good value proposition to someone. So I wish you the best. It's a tough thing to start your own business.
Yeah, I like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
Lots of good advice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm sorry. And finally, I would say there are opportunities for women-owned businesses.
Ha, there we
And
go.
you should,
That's leading into my question. Perfect.
yes, and you should take that opportunity. Again, there are, if you work for the United Nations as an example, the United Nations has got all kinds of requirements that you have to have gender balance, country balance. I mean, they got to balance like 93 different things. It's a very difficult organization to work within because you have all these rules and regulations. And if you don't do something right, then the Japanese complain to you that you don't do this. If you have too many men, then the women complain to you. If you have, too many people from Africa, then the North Americans complain. But you can use that to your advantage if you get a sense of, I represent an underrepresented group. And the government agency, it's mostly government agencies, but you can get this with certain companies too. They're out there looking for people who represent certain underserved populations. And I would not be shy at all about using that to your advantage. Again, that gets you to what you want. Keystone accounts, which is, I believe, what your real question is. Keystone accounts, you got to have a few. And you have to go after that relentlessly, because otherwise nothing will ever change.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and you already tapped into what I had in the back of my mind. You more or less already answered it, but because you mentioned raise your hand, and I totally feel that, if an interesting topic, something that's close to your passion pops up, you said, well, I just kept raising my hand. However, I'd still be interested as a woman, maybe I'm not always all that confident that I should be raising my hand. Now, I'm very aware of what you mentioned, that, you don't need to be the fastest as long as you don't need to outrun the bear, as long as you outrun the person slower than you, who's behind you. But then still, because you mentioned the confidence, and I, as a woman, but maybe more women, are not always that confident. How would I'm not asking you on advice on how to be a confident woman, but when we are in this sphere, and when we're talking about getting your first job, getting started, I mean, once you're there, I imagine it will keep going. But what would be a safe space to raise your hand first?
Well, there's a judgment call. I'll try to give you two pieces of information. One is, I'm trying to remember his name now. It's an Eastern European gentleman working at Harvard who did some research on the transferability of excellence, right? So you are a woman in an organization and you're going to move, right? Is your performance transferable? And is there a difference between men and women? And again, I wish I could remember his name at the moment. Nice guy. I work with him, but it's been a while. But there's this idea that men have the advantage because they have networks and other sort of things, the old boys network kind of idea. Mm-hmm. But often, again, according to this research, their performance does not always transfer, right? Because they take jobs for different reasons. Women, on the other hand, look for supportive frameworks, for mentors, for other sort of things. And because those have more impact on performance, they tend to be more successful as they move from company A to company B. So first of all, I said there is some academic research out there, and the idea that it is more likely that you're going to transfer performance, I think, should give you confidence. So if that's a roundabout way to get to that answer. The second is, this is really about influence mapping. So I go to the United Nations. I know nobody. I'm not a career UN person. I have a budget. I forget what my budget was. It was unbelievably tiny. It's one of those things I probably never would have taken the job if I actually knew what I was getting myself into. But nevertheless, I was there. I'm in New York, and I realized I've got like $3 million or some tiny amount of money. But as I look around, I realize my budget is actually bigger than most other agencies. I said, wow. And I have the head of my agency, Mark Malloch Brown, who's now Lord Malloch Brown, saying he wants to be the McKinsey of development consulting. So, there's an entry point for me. And I sat down with him. So I did my research on what does McKinsey spend. And I sat down with Mark and I said, Mark, we spend about 0.9% of payroll on learning and development. And I want to be the McKinsey of development. I think that's fantastic. But McKinsey is spending right now, and I talked to the head of learning over there, about 6% of payroll. And by the way, they pay their people twice as much. So it probably means not a 600% difference. It probably means a 1200% difference. So I'm not a miracle worker. Right? I can't do what you want me to do that the best company does in the world and do it on 8% of the investment. Cannot be done. So I need your help. I want to help you. So you got to find partners. I also looked around for who was important in my organization towards getting more resources. And you say, well, what's their biggest problem? So I found the guy at the head of the Bureau of Management is trying to introduce an ERP system. I had just come from a technology advisory firm. I wanted to get involved in another ERP implementation, like I wanted to, put a pencil through my forehead. Nevertheless, I solved this for him. And the same thing, I realized I had $100,000 in my budget for this ERP implementation, which was the largest ERP implementation on planet Earth. 156 countries simultaneously from a legacy program on out, 27 modules. The whole thing was absolutely crazy. And I went in and I sat in a meeting and I told him, and I gave him the research from Gartner Group, and I was at a similar company, Giga Information Group. And I said, what are you spending on this? And he told me, and I said, how many function points you got? And I walked down through it. I said, well, I got $100,000. I said, my guess is you need 7 million. Okay. So either give me 6,900,000 to do the job and I'll do it for you, or let me give you the $100,000 back. And I want to be on the opposite side of the planet when you go live, because this is going to be the biggest unmitigated disaster I've ever seen in my life. He ultimately found me $6.5 million, and I worked on the project for him. But by doing that, I increased my budget from 3 million to 37 million. In part because no one could figure out the knowledge management project. I said, I'll do that. I'll take that on. And I found that the UN women didn't have anybody helping them. I said, I'm not a woman, but I'm happy to help. I got resources. How do we do this? And I went out, and it turned out that I found the Dutch Development Agency. This is networking. Well, they're doing the same thing we were doing. We were doing governance at a federal level. They're doing it at a local level. I said, it just makes sense to work together. And at the environmental group, I went to the U.S. Smithsonian. Why? Because I thought they had a lot of money. And so, what a logical partnership. And you're trying to influence change in the UN. I'm an American. We can do this. So you find partners, but it's all about the same sort of thing I said earlier on starting a business. You got to find the pain points where you can really add value, not necessarily, again, on where you really want to go. You got to start, and then you build the social and political capital that allows you to say, by the way, I just solved your ERP problem. I saved your career. Can you work with me on this other issue, which I think is really important? Just give me the time of day to listen to my proposal and do it. So the answer is solve someone else's problem first, build social and political capital, and ask them, give me some honest feedback. I think this is incredibly important. I need advocates. Will you help me? And if not, tell me why. Give me your honest reason.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I think that's great advice, Peter. Thank you. I am not certain, Mike, have we got other questions in the chat?
No, not yet.
All
But
right.
I'll pose one if I may, just
Of
to keep us
course.
going. Peter, the term ESG,
Yep.
it seems to be getting a little bit of a toxic name in some quarters at the moment, particularly maybe North America. And my view is, and this may well be wrong, is that maybe ESG is just so big and so enormous, people don't quite know what to do and where to do it. So back to kind of, where do I start, all that sort of stuff, and hopefully we can come on to a bit of that later. But what's your view? Is ESG as a term kind of losing its way a bit, and maybe do we just need to go back to the good old-fashioned sustainability?
At the end of the day, you have to really, the problem is not ESG. The problem is that we have yet not figured out how to do this idea of dual materiality. How can organizations, corporate organizations, create different forms of value that are not just charitable, which would take us back to corporate social responsibility. I put on my website, we do 4,000 volunteer hours and all sorts of other things, which have nothing to do with my core business, but I do. I support the local kids teams or something like that. I really have to get down to, how do I solve this problem of value creation, the social value creation, and is it my responsibility? We really haven't figured it out yet. So I have a lot of empathy for organizations who struggle with that. you've got this push-pull where governments are saying we're not making enough progress, so I'm going to make you report on a whole bunch of things, right? And or investors saying, particularly with climate change, I see a lot of risk and I don't see it in your disclosures. And when I see it in your disclosures, I don't believe it. So we have this tug of war going on. And one side is saying, and the US reaction to this to me is largely a political kind of discourse, where this idea of woke, kind of whatever that means, comes into play here. So I think if you really are a sustainability change professional, you need to have some courage in your convictions. And the fact that someone is going to come in and say blah, 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 blah about all sorts of things, you need to stick to your guns a little bit. But sticking to your guns in this, and one of the things I lay out in the book, there is a pathway from compliance to experimentation to full integrated reporting that really is about telling your story. That's what this is all about. And the story is about value creation. If all you're doing is going out to the SASB site, downloading your requirements and filling out a form, well, what do you want me to tell you? You're not really committed to this anyway. And if your investors are not there, but I'll guarantee you, despite the dialogue in the United States, banks, insurance companies are very interested in ESG disclosures, because it affects their bottom line. They're losing billions of dollars. So the reality of the marketplace is running up against the politics of this nonsense. And will the name change? Don't really care.
No, exactly. No.
If it does, it does, whatever. Call it, add some other acronym in, don't really care. It's imperfect, but it's a starting point. And again, so when I go back to my knowledge thing, I don't even remember if I finished that. So you have knowledge of enduring value, contextual knowledge, variable knowledge, and true breakthrough knowledge. You have 4 categories. So ESG is in that category of both contextual and variable. And since we don't have good definitions, so I liken this when I say knowledge maturity. I say if I get 5 CFOs in a room and I say, all right, let's talk about a balance sheet. No one asks what a balance sheet is. And if they did, I would disinvite them from the meeting. I say, you're not a CFO, get out of here, right? This is a standard. Everybody knows what this means. If I get a bunch of 5 human resource people in a room and I say, let's talk about high potential employees. Well, first thing everybody's going to do is say, well, what do you mean by high potential? And what about this? And what about that? And how do you categorize it? That is a less certain sort of knowledge. You get involved with ESG, despite the desire to harmonize, which is very real, and some real powerful players are pushing this. If you talk to people like Michael Bloomberg, he's not backing away from ESG, and he's a powerful voice in this. And to be honest, I'm going to vote with Mike Bloomberg at the moment, because I think that kind of investor and business information person is going to be much more important to this dialogue than a bunch of politicians who are worried about being less woke or more woke or some other nonsense. But you are in an area of highly variable knowledge. And you just have to accept that. It says it's going to evolve over time. And ESG in 2030, maybe it's totally different. Maybe we don't use those terms anymore. Got me. But again, I wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thank you.
There is another question in the chat posed by Alexander. Alexander, are you happy to ask the question yourself? I'll wait for a second if you'll unmute. And if you don't, then I'll ask your question. But you do. Excellent.
Wait, if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Can hear you.
Okay. Well, Peter, you mentioned at the start about climate change, that not much has happened, has changed in sense of, I understand what you meant, that it's there. I mean, but my impression is that now we are seeing it, and that companies are really realizing what climate risk means, even though if one checks their books, it's still, where pandemic was before 2019. So, I mean, from your experience, from what you're seeing, do you think that there is this climate risk has indeed been upgraded, let's say, to something serious, something that can really influence companies, and they are looking into it and sort of integrating that. Because my impression is something that's so big as if you have a network, for example, as a company, of course you're looking at the risk of the network. If you have let's say a services company, you're looking at the if you have goods, you're looking at the supply chain very seriously, at the supply chain security. So I don't know, what do you see in this regard? Thanks.
Well, first of all, as an author, I want to compliment you on your rather big bookshelf. But I want to remind you there that every one of those books represents 2 pounds of carbon emissions. So, got to start moving towards ebooks. But having said that, first of all, it's very real. But with all, if you have a book up there by John Kotter, in particular, John Kotter will tell you that no change happens without a great sense of urgency. And it is part of the human condition that we wait until the proverbial stuff hits the fan until we change, right? So we know that by organizational learning, we know that. So the fact that people are not selling their beachfront real estate, despite evidence that the storm risk is big, well, because they like their beachfront. They don't feel like moving. And politicians don't want to make the move, because the vast majority of people on Earth live in a river valley or along the coast because it's nice. However, the banks who hold the mortgages and the people who write the insurance, they're very concerned about the risk. And if I look at the United States and we do a 10-year forward-looking rolling average of billion-dollar storm events, well, the top states are right along the Gulf, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida. So what are you seeing in all those markets? You're seeing all the insurance companies leave, because they're telling, listen, unless you underwrite us and, only allow us to take the intermediate risk while you take the higher end risk or the low end risk, we're not going to write in your market. And then those markets are going to turn over to the states or the federal government. And either you're going to just make it a loss leader because there's where the political votes are. But in any industry, you have leaders. So I would go back, and I'm going to forget the guy's name. Early 60s, the gentleman who wrote the book on the introduction of market innovations, who coined the terms early adopter and late adopter and laggard and things like that, which we still use today. That's where we are.
Christensen.
No, that would be that's disruptive innovation later. A marketing guy in the early 60s, and I shouldn't say these things without remembering what his name is. But he is in my first book, so I'll absolve myself of that. You're going to have to read the first book to get the answer to that one. It's just a question of where you are in a specific industry, right? So if you're automotive at the moment, you're still selling mostly gas and diesel engines. But it doesn't change the fact that something on the order of $100 billion has been committed to new factories and converting to EVs. That's not a small investment. People realize that they have 2 problems. 1, the future looks very different than today. But 2, how do I get there, right, while maintaining profitability and not getting ahead of my customer? That is a difficult transition. Not every industry, not every country feels the same pressure. So here in Southeast Asia, if you're in Malaysia, well, you haven't had a major weather event. So you're like, I'm an insurance company, but nothing's really happened, mostly because I'm surrounded by islands. And those islands prevent me from having the weather event that I have in the Caribbean basin, as an example. But Europe has been very, forward thinking about it. Although a lot of Europe's forward thinking has been driven recently by the Ukraine-Russian war and the fact that energy supplies were turned off. That's a real good motivator. That's that sense of urgency I was talking about. All of a sudden it's cold and I don't have any energy. All right, I'm now motivated to do something. But that's going to create a tipping point. And as soon as you get to a tipping point, all the key industries, all the keystone industries, right, drive the supply chains. If you want to be a player, you have to do that. I was contacted recently by a company in North Africa and Morocco that make wiring harnesses, right, to talk to them about their strategy. And again, it's a really good question. Where is the industry going? How fast is it going? Now, I don't have a crystal ball. And since many of you are involved in agile thinking or design thinking, this is where certain practices are better in very volatile markets because it allows you to mitigate the risk. So right now you have industries growing up that are part of new solutions and entire industries that are growing up just about mitigation. How do I make the problem less severe and balance out my risk and reward here? But all represent opportunity. And to me, if I'm a politician, you have to narrow this down. You can't change 1,000 industries simultaneously. You got to pick the ones which can have the greatest impact, right? That are keystone in nature, that have long tails to them. If you affect them, you affect everybody else. So, if you're even in education, right? The big disruptive in education is this whole idea of online learning, that you can be a Udemy or a Coursera and have more revenue per year than an Oxford or a London Business School or somebody else. It's quite disruptive. And at the end of the day, it comes back to the money. That's what people notice, right? Either the risk potential on money or disruptions in revenue streams. But you can predict, then going back to Clay Christensen, since you mentioned his name, Clay's work would predict that if I simply look at the league tables for every industry this year and forecast out 10 years from now, a lot of the leaders today will not be around in 10 years, right? Because they will not be able to get out of their own way because the mental model they have of the world constrains them so much that they can't do it, which is why we then get back to learning strategies of how do I break that mental model individually or organizationally. And that to me is the niche I'm trying to help people in. Again, it's easy to say, hard to make 10,000 or 100,000 or 200,000 people change the way they do things. Did I answer your question, by the way? Okay. I babbled on for a while, so just to make sure I actually answered something.
Well, Alexander looks really content. So apart from, of course, your joke about the bookshelves, but he looks really content. So I think that was an answer to his question. All right, Peter. Well, I think there's plenty of people who would still have a million of questions, but unfortunately, we're also running out of time. So I am going to thank you a lot for your insights and your wisdom. I'm also giving the word to Scott, who would probably want to wrap it up as the meetups host and organizer. So thanks a lot, Peter, and I will be getting your book, and I will have to admit I will probably get a hard copy because I'm still a sucker for hard copies when it comes to books. So right. Thanks a lot.
Just make sure you offset yourself 2.2 pounds. Okay.
Yes. I'll plant a tree too.
There you go.
Just make sure you don't go to Bangkok to get it signed either.
That's right.
Thanks a lot, Peter. I really enjoyed this talking to you. Also, the 8 o'clock slot works very well for me. I'm quite enjoying starting my day. You've given me lots of thoughts, and Mike and I will reach out to you afterwards, and we'll probably be doing some things. I've only got one thing I'd like to say in closing. Will you come back in 2024?
Well, it feels so far away, but I guess it's already November. But certainly, if I have 30 seconds left, I would like to leave you with some things that you guys can think about, right? As I mentioned earlier, with all this changing stuff, the things that are really, I think, having a difference is how companies think about purpose, right? There's a lot of new research on purpose and how that becomes the sort of the North Star for the business. There's a lot about this idea of accountability. Right, my legal status versus my accountability status. How do I frame that and help people think about that? There's a lot to be said around design thinking things and the tools that are still necessary. But if I were to point at one that is maybe newer and different, it's the idea of impact networks. And impact networks are a variation on the theme. Networks are not new, but impact networks talk about the idea that the problem is bigger than your organization. And therefore, you really have to think about partnerships relative to this idea of purpose, which may be different than thinking about networks in terms or partnerships in terms of your unique selling proposition or your competitive differentiation. And it may seem like a small issue, but it's really not. And there's a lot of new and different work going out about that. Now, if you don't wish to do any of that work, you'll have to wait for my third book to come out later next year, and you can read all about it. But my apologies, Scott, for interrupting.
Not at all. Well, definitely get you back. Perhaps even help you launch a book and get it around the network. I think we are an impact network as a group, and looking at the topics that we're looking at. And yeah, honestly, wonderful time this morning. I'm going to go and run off to the conference now, but you really have given me a boost to the day. Thank you, Peter.
Well, you're welcome.
Just
Very
or
good.
this or whatever it is we do.
Yes.
And well, anyway, thank you for allowing me to talk to you. My mission is to create a lot of sustainability champions who go forth and do great things. I'm getting old, so I need younger people out there to carry forward with this sort of thing. And they need to do it all over the planet Earth. So it really is a legacy issue for everybody. That if you want to leave a planet for your children or your grandchildren or your neighbor's children or whatever it is, or your dogs or your pets, it's an absolutely critical issue, and that you have to do something yourself. You cannot wait for other people to do it. And as I say in my book, the biggest mistake that people make is they think someone else will solve the problem. It ain't happening. It's you. So, and with that, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks,
Bye.
Peter. Thanks,
Bye, everyone.
everybody.
Thanks a lot. Have a nice
Thank
day.
you.
Bye bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Have fun
Thank you.
today,
Have a nice
Scott.
day.
Bye.